Hello everyone and welcome back to Classical Mythology. This is part 2 of Module 1 where we will be looking at some aspects of the concept of myth. What is it? How do we understand it? As well as some of the methodological questions that will be guiding us throughout the rest of the term. Last time we went over aspects of the course outline and syllabus, the evaluation components, the written assignment, discussion groups, etc. If you still have any questions about that, please feel free to contact me through email, or you could also reach out to one of the TAs as well. Now, as for the concept of myth, for many people, the very idea of myth has, at least in terms of how the word is used in modern English, it's come to mean something that's false, non-factual, or didn't happen. People say, oh, that's just a myth. But the Greek term mythos is a bit more subtle and inclusive. It basically communicates the idea of a tale, a speech, a story, or an account of something. But understood in a larger sense, I think the best way to translate mythos is a sacred story. So myths, from antiquity at least, are stories or collections of stories that communicate communal values. So the important thing is not whether or not they happened. That usually can't be demonstrated with any certainty. People in antiquity certainly did believe their myths had some basis in reality. But more important is what the myths actually mean. What are they communicating to the audience? And very often we find things like key social values embodied in the symbolism and archetypes of mythological stories. And I think it's pretty well understood now that mythology is one of the ways in which societies pass on their basic values and ethics, priorities, and traditions. They basically provide a framework for people in that society to view the world and operate in that world. They underline certain assumptions and expectations. Myths also carry with them the connotation of sacred, as I said, the idea of the sacred story, but not always. Now, this gets into the question, which I think is an important one: what's the connection between mythology and religion? Well, from one perspective, what we classify as mythology is really the remnants of a dead religion. It's the stories and narratives that, as we'll see, justified very often religious rituals and activities that have become disembedded from their original religious context, or there's no longer a community or culture that believes in the gods that these stories were passed on about. So when that happens, the collection of narratives, even if they continue to be told by later subsequent cultures, they get cast as mythological. So I think that partly explains the notion of the untruthfulness of mythology, is this idea that they apply to a religious framework that no longer exists or is no longer believed in. At the same time, those mythological stories very often take on a life of their own even after the original religious context has ceased to be, and they get recycled and retold and reimagined often for centuries. And that's one of the things we're going to be looking at throughout the course. So I think we need to begin by moving beyond a sort of superficial understanding as myth as something that's untrue. there are lots of stories that aren't necessarily factually true, but they still communicate important information and, in a certain sense, communicate truth. You can just think of a novel, for instance. You can imagine a novel that you've read that has had a great impact on you. The story itself may not actually be factual, it could be made up, but it still communicates something about human experience and the human condition. Moreover, the world around us is filled with mythological traditions. I think even though we're talking about classical mythology in this course, and that applies particularly to the ancient context, our own contemporary culture is filled with its own mythologies that are extremely influential and important. Now, some scholars have sought to distinguish myth from what we might call legend or folk tale. According to these interpreters, myths are stories that involve divine beings from the remote past, whereas legends and folk tales represent more recent human experiences and are primarily concerned with moral lessons. Other scholars see myth as a network of stories, images and symbols, and even actions, as we'll see. In isolation, an individual element of the myth might not mean very much, but gains its meaning as part of a larger body of storytelling or as part of a corpus. Myths are also rarely explicit in their messaging. They don't usually spell out the message they are trying to transmit. Rather, they are elusive. The audience is invited to reflect upon the story and to interpret it and discern its meaning or its multiple meanings. And these meanings often change over time. Other scholars in modern times have also focused on the functionality of myth. What are myths for? What do they accomplish? What is their social or cultural purpose as they express themselves throughout time? And I think it's also clear that every culture throughout history has its own collection of what we might call mythological stories. So it is a very common pattern of human behavior and communication. So we want to get to the root of, what is so important about these stories that necessitates them being repeated hundreds, if not thousands of times over the centuries. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we can view mythology on the one hand as providing a kind of comprehensive framework for understanding individual experiences. And in that way, mythology allows people to kind of universalize their experience and to understand that they're not alone in the sort of things that happen to them and the sort of challenges that they face throughout their life, that they are participating in a kind of larger repeating story. Now, the textbook that we're using for the course provides its own kind of basic definition, which I provided here for reference. And this is not a perfect definition, but it's the one the author of the textbook is using as the basis for their presentation of the material. So the textbook definition states that whether the form of a myth is an oral story, a written document, or a painted image, it always includes metaphors and symbols that engage viewers' emotions or that compel viewers to search out what its metaphors, symbols, and stories mean. So here's this idea that the meaning isn't immediately obvious. There's usually some kind of encoded message that the audience or the viewer has to figure out for themselves. So that is the idea of symbolism, allegory, metaphor, etc. The content of a myth is composed of the religious, political, and cultural values and meanings about self, society, and cosmos that it offers, which are often hidden in the myth's metaphors, symbols, images, and stories. So once people interrogate the mythological narrative for its various meanings, out of that they build a kind of comprehensive worldview that involves elements of religion, politics, culture, and society. So to some extent, mythology is a social construct explaining itself to its members. What is important, what is sacred, what is forbidden, what is good, what is evil. And these are all sorts of information that need to be passed on through the generations, and mythological narratives and symbols are a good way to do that. The function of myths is to offer ways of locating one's experience in a broader framework, that one's own life, and of understanding this broader framework. For this reason, myths must be studied in particular context and must be part of a mythological corpus. So there we have this conjunction of the individual and the universal. So it's about individual experiences understood in a much larger setting. And one of the things that we will try to accomplish in this course is, when we look at particular myths, to understand what did they mean, or what were they perceived to mean in their original context. You know, what did they say to the people who first primarily told these stories? And then we can we can trace the evolution of that meaning throughout time, moving forward. So as I'm sure you're well aware, this course is focused in particular on quote-unquote classical mythology, because these are stories that come to us from the so-called classical world. So that is the cultures of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And the reason they're called classical is the fact that in the Renaissance and in subsequent periods of European intellectual history, Greece and Rome were viewed as a kind of high point of civilization that many subsequent European cultures and thinkers wanted to imitate and emulate. So it's for this reason that myth stories from the Greco-Roman context are often referred to as classical. But they are by no means the only mythology that exists, and certainly not the only mythology that existed in the ancient world. Every culture in every time period has its own version of mythological storytelling and symbolism. But the stories of the Greeks and Romans have a particularly far-reaching influence because of the kind of widespread nature of a quote-unquote Western cultural paradigm, and Greek myths in particular often serve as a basic frame of reference when people talk about mythology in general. And the reason for this has a lot to do with Athens of the 5th century before the Common Era. Ancient Athens has often been idealized as a cultural superpower, as a place where democracy and philosophy were supposed to have been developed, at least in a limited sense. But more than that, the ancient Athenians seem to have placed a high value on literature, and especially poetry. So when you look at the sort of writing that survives from 5th century Athens, a large proportion of it is poetical texts, and those examples of poetry are usually concerned with mythological topics and themes. So when ancient poets wrote, at least in the Greco-Roman context, they didn't necessarily have an interest in inventing new stories. This is a kind of counterintuitive idea today when modern authors are expected to offer the audience something new, even though very often they draw on something old. But still, there's a love of novelty in modern storytelling. Ancient audiences wanted to be told and retold the same stories over and over, and the unique interpretation that individual authors put on those well-known stories was what attracted people's interest. So the poetry and literature of ancient Athens was copied and studied long after the decline of the Athenian city-state in the 4th century BCE. So Athens, the great rival of Athens was, of course, Sparta. If you've taken any Greek history, Sparta was arguably a more powerful city-state. I mean, they won the great Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta in the 5th century. But Sparta was a very different society. It invested all its resources in maintaining what was essentially a totalitarian slave state at an early period of Sparta's history. They had enslaved a neighboring population, and ever since they put all their energy in maintaining that position of power over a population that vastly outnumbered them. As a result, there's almost no literature produced from Sparta, at least not anything that survives in a significant amount. Therefore, the subsequent reception of the classical tradition is very much dominated by the Athenian literary contribution. But when we're talking about classical mythology, generally we should divide those myths into various time periods that are reflective of the different periods in Greco-Roman literature. Some of the most ancient mythological stories come from what we call the Archaic period, and these are ultimately a reflection of oral traditions that extend even further back in time. And most prominently, we have Homer. Homer looms very large in the Greek mythological tradition. He's the first major Greek author, and the Iliad and Odyssey were extremely important texts and traditions to the Greek cultural consciousness. But those poems were part of a much larger series of epic cycles, most of which is lost to us because they weren't written down for various reasons. Particular episodes in the epic cycle about the Trojan War were written down, which provide us with the Iliad and the Odyssey. We also have Hesiod. We'll be talking more about him in the coming lectures. He is also important from a mythological perspective because he provides us with testimony to some of the origin stories that kind of laid the groundwork for the Greek mythological tradition. Then we move to the so-called classical period of ancient Greece, specifically 5th century Athens. There, one of the most important genres of writing was drama, especially tragedies. So the great tragic playwrights like Aeschylus and Sophocles, again, they weren't inventing new stories to entertain the audience, but they were recycling old and well-established mythological narratives to speak to their current context. So there is an element of innovation in the way that someone like Aeschylus or Sophocles or later Euripides deals with these myth stories. So there is a novelty there, but the audience expects them to build upon the existing mythological repertoire. Then you have someone like Plato in the 4th century who employs mythology in an interesting manner, either reinterpreting existing myths for various philosophical purposes or inventing myths himself, which then go on to become very popular and reinterpreted in their own right. Now, after the 5th century and the decline of Athens, and we move into the 4th century, this brings us to the period of Alexander the Great and his conquest of the ancient Near East, which resulted in the establishment of a number of Greek kingdoms in places like Egypt and Syria and Mesopotamia. This is known as the Hellenistic period, from the 4th century up until the 1st century before the Common Era. And one of the most important developments of the Hellenistic period was the founding of the city of Alexandria in Egypt, where we had the famous Library of Alexandria, what was known as the Museum. This was more of a research institute which attracted scholars and artists and writers and intellectuals from around the Mediterranean, and they all gathered to work with the library's enormous resources. Now, some of the librarians of the library at Alexandria were poets in their own right, so people like Callimachus, Apollonius, etc. But these people were more like scholar poets. It was at Alexandria that people first created editions of the classical poets, so editions of Homer and editions of the dramatists. They created encyclopedias and dictionaries and commentaries, this kind of meta-literature that is the hallmark of humanistic scholarship. These tools were really developed in the Hellenistic period, especially at places like Alexandria. People like Callimachus and Apollonius, they are immersed in the Greek mythological tradition, but they take a very scholarly attitude towards it as reinterpreters and commentators. By the 1st century BCE, the Roman Empire is very much in development, and the Romans are gradually swallowing up various parts of the Mediterranean, including some of these Hellenistic kingdoms, eventually Egypt itself. And that imperial project requires some kind of ideological justification. And one of the ways that the Romans tried to do that was to insert themselves into the wider mythological tradition, especially the Greek mythological tradition. We'll probably say more about that later on, but Romans were great admirers of Greek culture in all its aspects, and they assimilated it and absorbed it to a high degree. So when we're talking about the culture of the Roman period, it's really an amalgam of existing, Greek cultural paradigms and what the Romans brought themselves to the culture that they built. So Roman writers like Virgil or Ovid or others of the same period, they are also very interested in mythological stories, but the majority of what they reference comes from Greek predecessors. So when we look at Roman literature specifically, we really see a kind of mass assimilation and recycling of the whole of the Greek mythological tradition, to which the Romans add a few of their own kind of unique mythological narratives. But the Romans certainly aren't known generally to be innovators in the realm of mythology, but rather reinterpreters, and they employed the mythological repertoire for their own purposes. But again, these writers and these stories aren't the only well-attested myths from the ancient world. If we look further to the east, to Mesopotamia, you have things like the Epic of Gilgamesh, the various biblical traditions. Those are also extremely important. And as we'll see, it's well understood today that there was an important or significant degree of interaction and influence between Greco-Roman mythological traditions and those of the ancient Near East. Not to mention, of course, the mythologies found throughout the world, which are unfortunately beyond the scope of our current course. Now, as much as we are focused on looking at myth and mythic symbols and mythic narratives in an ancient context, I think it's important that we always keep an eye on mythology as it exists today, because you can see very clearly the influence of ancient myth stories on our own current mythological cultures. And the mediums that you find these modern mythological narratives are very much what some people would classify as popular culture, and I'm not particularly fond of this differentiation of popular culture from other forms of culture, but you might say a kind of mass consumption cultural products like novels and comic books and films and TV shows and increasingly video games. These are filled with contemporary versions of myth stories. Some are directly inspired by the types of stories we see in the Greco-Roman period. Some draw on medieval folklore and legends, sagas, etc., or they are completely newly invented. So because we have this interest today in new stories and novelty in storytelling, we have a number of examples of kind of mythological universes that are completely built from the ground up. But even there, it's difficult to escape the kind of deeply rooted patterns that exist in all forms of mythology. And many of these modern mythological narratives are orientated towards the future. So it's not surprising that science fiction is a very important genre for mythological storytelling. I mean, I know the Star Wars universe technically isn't in the future, but it still fits into that general category. So in case someone is composing an email to correct me on that, I'm fully aware of it already. Whereas people in antiquity were much more focused on the past, so the types of myth stories that they told and interpreted and understood referred to a long past early period of their civilization. So in the case of the Greeks, it was the Trojan War that provides the kind of foundational narrative that helped explain what their culture was all about. And we certainly have mythologies today that are looking towards the past, but We also have a number of very important ones that are more future focused, because our society has a lot of anxiety about what's going to happen to our civilization in the kind of short term and long term. But even modern mythologies evidence a significant degree of change. So just as a kind of example here, we can take the figure of Batman, who's only been around for about 100 years, but the whole kind of universe of superhero storytelling, that is very much a modern form of mythology. But over that relatively short period of time, the figure of Batman has changed substantially from his early days as the kind of crime-fighting vigilante to the 1960s, where you had the Batman TV show, where he's almost an absurd kind of campy figure. That was very much a product of the time. There's obviously various, other comic series that present different takes on the figure of Batman. But more recently in films, you have the Tim Burton version of Batman, who was a kind of, gothic figure. And then more recently, the Dark Knight, who, that film in particular is very much a product of the post 9/11 period and anxieties about violence and terrorism. So even though the kind of core symbol is the same, the man in the bat suit, the context in which that story is told changes, because people are concerned with different things in different time periods. So if a figure like Batman can change substantially over the course of a century, just think about how other myth stories develop over the course of several centuries or even millennia. One of the other important aspects of the course moving forward is, as much as we will be looking at mythological narratives and mythological characters and symbols, this course isn't simply about getting to know a bunch of those stories. We want to interpret them in some way. So there's a theoretical side to all of this, as we want to explain what is the purpose of these mythological narratives. And people have been trying to do that since antiquity. You can just look to someone like Euhemerus in the 4th century BCE. He famously had this explanation for the stories about the gods that were told, saying that they were just famous people who, after their deaths, were turned into gods. It was a kind of radical understanding of mythology in an ancient context. It also becomes very evident, and we're going to be looking at this with a few examples, that ancient myth stories very often have an explanatory function. So this is what we call an ideology. So they are meant to explain some aspect of the natural world, or some feature of the landscape, or some institution in society. Some are more obvious than others in this regard, but we'll look at a few of those. And since the 19th century, there's been a variety of attempts by a whole host of different scholars and intellectuals to try to either explain or explain away the existence of mythology. Famously, in the 19th century, the great linguist Max Muller called mythology a disease of language, and that it was really a byproduct of linguistic evolution over the course of time. other people and lots of different fields of inquiry are interested in mythology, not just classicists or ancient historians. The great psychologist Carl Jung was deeply interested in mythology and its psychological function, especially around the idea of symbolism, what he called the archetypes that he thought he could see present in myth stories from around the world. And the similarities between the myths from different cultures led him to believe that all of humanity has this kind of subconscious repertoire of symbolism and kind of storytelling structures that get manifested at different places and different times, and even in people's dreams. So one of the reasons he was interested in mythology was to help people understand their own psychological processes. And Jung's work really inspired a whole wave of comparative mythology, especially in the 20th century. This was a hugely important and fashionable endeavor to bring together the different mythologies from around the world and look to them for similarities. The most famous practitioner of this was Joseph Campbell, who was unapologetically very much a Jungian. And his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, among other books that he wrote, really popularized the idea of mythology, especially from a comparative perspective. Most famously, the notion of the hero's journey, which is a kind of ultimate story arc that you see in a lot of different myth narratives. We'll be talking about that later in the course. So that's all for this installment. Bear in mind as we move forward, we're closely kind of following the structure of the textbook in terms of the material it presents. Then we want to put that material in context. We want to then apply some kind of interpretive framework, and then finally look at the reception of that story in some later period. So we're looking at classical mythology from a variety of angles, and hopefully that will give us a better understanding of the ongoing importance of these symbols and narratives for the last, several centuries.